Marcus Webb checked his reflection in the restaurant bathroom mirror for the third time that evening. 41 years old. Grey threading through his temples. A small scar above his left eyebrow from a bicycle accident when Caleb was 7. He looked, he decided, exactly like what he was. A man who hadn't been on a date in 3 years, trying very hard not to look like a man who hadn't been on a date in 3 years. He straightened his collar and walked back to the table. Jennifer was already on her phone. She didn't look up when he sat down. "Sorry," she said, "not sorry at all. My friend is asking about tomorrow." "Of course." Marcus lifted his water glass, set it down, lifted it again. The evening had started promisingly enough. Jennifer Alcott, divorced, no kids, worked in marketing, had seemed genuinely warm when they'd met through his co-worker Dana's dinner party 6 weeks ago. They'd texted for a month. Long texts, good texts. The kind where you laugh at your phone in the parking lot of a grocery store and feel something unfamiliar stirring in your chest. In person, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not rudely, just shifted, like a painting hung slightly crooked. Everything technically present, but nothing quite right. "So you said you have a son?" Jennifer asked, setting her phone face down. A gesture of effort that somehow made things worse. "Caleb, he's 9. That must be—" She searched for the word. "A lot." "It is," Marcus said. "He's also the best thing that ever happened to me, so—" Jennifer smiled. The smile of someone doing math in her head. They ordered. They ate. They talked about her work, his work, a Netflix series neither of them had actually finished. The pasta was good. The bread was better. The conversation moved the way a shopping cart moves with one bad wheel. Forward, technically, but never in a straight line and never without effort. At one point she asked him what he did for fun, and he almost said sleeping, which would have been honest, but instead he said he coached Caleb's baseball team in the spring. And she said, "Oh, that's sweet," and then looked at the dessert menu, even though neither of them wanted dessert. When the check came, Marcus paid without discussion and Jennifer said thank you, with the tone of someone closing a browser tab. Outside on the sidewalk, the October air had gone genuinely cold. A couple walked past them holding hands, laughing about something, their breath visible in little clouds that merged and disappeared. Marcus watched them for a half-second too long. "I had a really nice time," Jennifer said. There it is, he thought. "Me too," he said. "Because what else do you say? Because you don't say no, you didn't on a sidewalk at 9 o'clock to a woman who owes you nothing." They hugged, brief. The kind of hug that is really a period at the end of a sentence. He watched her walk to her car. She didn't look back, and he didn't blame her for that. He stood there a moment longer than necessary, hands in his pockets, the restaurant noise bleeding through the glass behind him. A busboy was clearing their table already. He could see it through the window. The candle snuffed, the glasses carried away, the whole evening reduced to a stack of dishes in someone's arms. He thought about calling Dana to say thanks for the setup. No hard feelings. It just wasn't there. He thought about texting Jennifer something generous and meaningless. He thought about the 40-minute drive home and what would be on the radio and whether Caleb had eaten his carrots or hidden them in the napkin again. Then he got in his car and pulled out of the lot, and the restaurant shrank in his rearview mirror until it was just another square of light among many, and then it was nothing at all. The house was too quiet after midnight. Marcus had always noticed this. The way silence in a home with a sleeping child is different from silence in an empty room. It has weight to it, presence. The refrigerator hummed its low idiot song, and the baseboard heater ticked, and somewhere down the hall, Caleb shifted in his bed and the whole house seemed to breathe with him. And still it was quiet in the way that made Marcus aware of his own hands, his own jaw, the particular uselessness of a man sitting at a kitchen table at 12:30 in the morning with nowhere to be and no one to call. He washed his water glass, dried it, put it away, took it back out and filled it again. The kitchen was small and had been small when he and Diane bought the house 11 years ago and had only gotten smaller since. He'd meant to repaint the cabinets last summer. He'd bought the paint. It was in the garage, on a shelf next to a circular saw he'd used once, and a box of Caleb's baby clothes that Diane had told him to throw away, and that he had not thrown away and would not throw away, a fact he had never said aloud to anyone. He sat back down. His phone was still on the table. He picked it up, put it down, picked it up again. He opened the text thread with Jennifer and stared at it the way you stare at a receipt after a purchase you already regret, not because the thing was wrong, but because the wanting of it had been so much larger than the having. He closed the thread, opened his email. 3 messages, a credit card statement, a newsletter from Caleb's school about a fundraiser he'd already forgotten, and an email from his boss, Rhonda Jeffries, sent at 11:47 p.m. Subject line simply, Monday, body text reading. Need to discuss your project timeline. My office, 8 a.m. He read it twice. The period after a.m. sat there like a stone. Rhonda did not send emails at midnight. Rhonda was a woman of boundaries, of office hours, of the kind of structured professionalism that Marcus had always found both admirable and slightly terrifying. She left at 5:15. She did not text on weekends. She had once told him during his first week at Hargrove and Associates that she believed work should be a room you walk into and walk out of, not a house you live in. And yet here she was at 11:47 p.m., sending a 2-sentence email about Monday. Marcus set the phone down and pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose. The project timeline. He knew what that meant. The Wellspring account, which had been his for 7 months, and which had been slowly, undeniably going sideways since August. Not through incompetence, not through laziness, through the accumulation of small emergencies that were his life. Caleb's ear infection in September that had cost him 2 days. The custody mediation in October that had eaten his focus for a week. The slow bleed of hours, lost to school pickups and doctor's appointments, and the 100 invisible tasks that no one at Hargrove and Associates ever saw, because no one at Hargrove and Associates had ever asked. He was not failing. He was almost failing, which was worse, because almost failing meant you could still see the version of yourself that wasn't. He turned off the kitchen light, walked down the hall, stopped at Caleb's door, which was open exactly 4 inches, the way Caleb insisted it be, not 3, not 5, 4, because 9-year-olds are theologians of routine. He could hear the breathing, slow and deep and untroubled. Marcus leaned his shoulder against the doorframe and stood there in the dark for a long time, listening to his son sleep, feeling the hours ahead of him stack up like dishes in a sink. The weekend stretched out, then Monday, then whatever Rhonda's email meant. He went to bed. He did not sleep for a long while. The knock came at 4:07 a.m. Not a pounding, not urgent in the way that makes you think fire, or ambulance, or someone dead. 3 knocks, evenly spaced, almost polite, which was somehow worse. Because a polite knock at 4 in the morning means someone has been thinking about knocking for a long time before they actually did it. Marcus was not asleep. He was sitting on the couch in the dark with the television off, his phone face down on the cushion beside him, doing the thing he'd been doing for 2 days now, which was nothing. Sitting in the particular stillness of a man who has run out of motion. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator's hum and the occasional tick of the baseboard heater kicking on against the October cold. 3 knocks. He didn't move at first. He thought maybe he'd imagined it. Then the shadow shifted behind the frosted glass of the front door, and he knew he hadn't. He stood, his knees cracked. He crossed the living room in his socks and opened the door without checking the peephole, which was either trust or exhaustion or both. Ray Dunn stood on the porch, his boss. Owner of Dunn & Associates, the mid-size accounting firm where Marcus had worked for 11 years. Ray was 62, built like a man who had once been athletic and had since made peace with gravity. He wore a canvas jacket over a flannel shirt, jeans, work boots. He looked like he'd come from somewhere that wasn't bed. His truck was parked at the curb, engine off, the cab light still fading. Marcus stared at him. "Ray?" "Marcus." A silence, the kind that holds its own weight. "It's 4 in the morning, Marcus said. "I know what time it is." "How do you know where I live?" "Your employment file. I'm your boss, Marcus. I have your address." This was technically true and still deeply strange. In 11 years, Ray Dunn had never been to his house. Ray Dunn communicated through email, through quarterly reviews, through the occasional nod in the hallway that carried the emotional range of a closed door. He was not a man who showed up. He was a man who sent memos. And yet here he was, standing on Marcus's porch at 4 in the morning, with his hands in his jacket pockets, and his breath making small clouds in the dark. "Can I come in?" Ray said. It wasn't a question. Marcus stepped aside. Ray walked into the living room and stood there, taking in the scene with the quiet efficiency of a man who notices things for a living. The dark television, the glass of water on the coffee table, untouched so long it had gone room temperature. The blanket bunched at one end of the couch, the general atmosphere of a man who had been sitting in the dark long enough that the dark had started to feel like furniture. Ray didn't comment on any of it. He turned and looked at Marcus. "Dana called me," he said. Marcus closed the front door, leaned against it. "Dana shouldn't have done that." "Probably not. She did anyway." "I'm fine, Ray." "I didn't ask if you were fine." Another silence. Down the hall, Caleb's door was closed. Marcus listened for a moment instinctively, the way he always listened, the way he'd been listening for 9 years. Nothing. Still asleep. Ray pulled out a kitchen chair and sat down without being invited, the way someone sits when they intend to stay long enough that standing would become a problem. He put his hands flat on the table, big hands, scarred knuckles, hands that had done something other than accounting before they'd done accounting. "I'm going to say one thing," Ray said, "and then you're going to decide what to do with it, and then I'm going to leave. And we're never going to talk about the fact that I came to your house at 4 in the morning. Agreed?" Marcus didn't sit down. He stood in the doorway between the living room and the kitchen, arms crossed, feeling the cold from outside still pressing through the door at his back. "Agreed," he said. The coffee was too hot and neither of them touched it. Marcus sat at his own kitchen table across from Ray Dunn, who looked like he'd driven here in whatever he'd been sleeping in. Wrinkled flannel shirt, hair pressed flat on one side, his truck keys still in his hand like he'd forgotten he was holding them. The clock on the microwave said 4:23. Marcus had opened the door expecting something terrible. A fire at the warehouse, an accident, someone dead. You don't get a knock at 4 in the morning and think good news. His heart had been slamming before he even turned the deadbolt. But Ray had just stood there on the porch with his hands at his sides and said, "Can I come in?" So here they were. Ray set the keys down, picked them up, set them down again. Marcus recognized the gesture because it was exactly what he did with water glasses when he didn't know what to say. "I'm going to tell you something," Ray said, "and I need you to just hear it before you respond." "Okay. I mean it. Don't talk until I'm done." "Okay, Ray." Ray looked at the coffee, looked at the window above the sink where the dark was still total, not even a suggestion of morning at the edges. He rubbed the back of his neck with one hand, and Marcus could hear the scratch of his palm against stubble. 31 years ago, I started Dunn Millwork with a circular saw and $1,100 my uncle loaned me. I didn't know what I was doing. I'm not saying that to be humble. I genuinely did not know. I cut my own thumb open the second week and drove myself to the ER because I couldn't afford to close the shop for the day. He paused. Marcus waited. I've had 6 employees in those 31 years who I would call essential. Not good, not reliable. Essential. The kind of person where if they left, the thing I built would become a different thing. Worse. Smaller. Ray's jaw worked like he was chewing something that wouldn't break down. "You're one of the 6. Marcus opened his mouth. "I said don't talk." Marcus closed his mouth. "I know what you make. I know what it costs to raise a boy alone in this economy. I know what your rent is because I've driven past your building and I'm not an idiot. I know you've been looking at job listings in Raleigh because Dana told me. And before you get mad at Dana, she told me because she's worried about you and she's right to be." The refrigerator hummed. Down the hall, nothing stirred. Caleb slept the way only children sleep, like the world had signed a contract to leave them alone until morning. Ray leaned forward, both forearms on the table. He looked at Marcus with the kind of directness that costs something, that you can feel in your sternum. "I'm not losing you over money." 1 sentence, 6 words, ordinary words, every one of them. Nothing that would look remarkable written down on paper or repeated to someone later over the phone. But Marcus felt them land in a place he hadn't known was exposed. Some load-bearing wall inside him that had been taking weight so long he'd stopped recognizing it as weight. His eyes burned. He looked at the coffee. "Now you can talk," Ray said. Marcus didn't talk. He pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose and breathed in through his teeth and sat there while something restructured itself quietly in his chest. Ray didn't fill the silence. He just sat across the table in his wrinkled flannel with his keys and his bad hair and waited the way you wait for wood glue to set, knowing that rushing it ruins everything. When Marcus finally looked up, his voice came out rough and plain. "What exactly are you proposing?" Ray almost smiled. Not quite. The corner of his mouth moved a fraction of an inch. "I thought you'd never ask." Caleb had known about the date for 11 days before it happened. Not because his father told him. His father had said he was going to dinner with a friend, which was the kind of lie adults told when they thought children were stupid. And Caleb was not stupid. He'd heard the phone call with Dana. He'd been in the hallway getting his backpack, and his father had been in the kitchen saying things like, "I don't know, what's she like? And no, I'm not nervous, I just want to know what she's like," in a voice that was absolutely nervous. Caleb had stood there with one strap over his shoulder and listened to his father laugh in a way he didn't usually laugh, higher and shorter. And he'd felt something move through his chest that he couldn't name. It wasn't jealousy. He'd thought about that later, lying in bed, turning the feeling over the way you turn a rock in your hand, looking for the smooth side. It wasn't jealousy because jealousy was wanting something someone else had. And this wasn't that. This was more like standing on the edge of a pool and knowing the water was going to be cold. Not bad, just cold, just different from the air. He knew things about his father that his father didn't know he knew. He knew his father sometimes sat at the kitchen table after Caleb went to bed and didn't do anything. Not his phone, not the TV, not a book. Just sat. Caleb had gotten up for water once and seen him there, hands flat on the table, staring at the wall where the calendar hung. The calendar had Caleb's soccer schedule and dentist appointments, and the weekends marked D for Diane. His father had been staring at it like it was a window instead of a calendar, like he could see through it to something on the other side. Caleb had gone back to bed without the water. He knew his father was tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. Tired in his shoulders. Tired in the way he sometimes paused in the middle of making dinner, just stopped with the spatula in his hand, and looked at the eggs like he'd forgotten what eggs were for. Then he'd blink and come back and flip them and say something about homework or soccer practice, and the pause would close up behind him like water. He knew about the job too. Not everything, but enough. He knew his father had come home one day 5 weeks ago and sat on the edge of his bed with the door open and pressed his fingers into his eyes. Caleb had walked past and his father had looked up and smiled and said, "Hey buddy, how was school?" And the smile was the wrong shape. Too wide, too quick. Like a door someone opens before you've even knocked. After that, things got quieter. Not in the house, in his father. The volume of him turned down a notch. He still made breakfast, still drove Caleb to school, still asked about his day, and meant it. But there was a new gap somewhere, a thin space between the asking and the hearing. Like his father was listening through a wall, Caleb didn't ask about any of it. He was 9, but he understood that some things you don't ask about because asking makes them real in a way that's harder for everyone. So instead he did what he could. He ate his carrots without being told twice. He put his cleats by the door. He didn't complain about the weekends at his mother's house even when he wanted to stay. And sometimes, walking through a parking lot or standing in line at the hardware store, he reached over and took his father's hand. Not because he needed to. Because he'd learned something in his 9 years that most people spent their whole lives circling around without ever quite landing on. You can't fix the weight someone carries, but you can stand next to them while they carry it. And sometimes that changes the math just enough. Marcus poured 2 cups of coffee because that was what you did when someone was sitting at your kitchen table at 4 in the morning and had just said the thing that changed the shape of everything. He poured them slowly. He needed the seconds. Ray Donovan sat with his hands flat on the table like a man who had learned a long time ago not to fidget when something mattered. He watched Marcus move through the small kitchen without comment. The fluorescent light above the stove buzzed at a frequency that had bothered Marcus for 2 years and that he had never fixed. Marcus set the mug down in front of Ray and sat across from him. "Say it again," Marcus said. "I want you to run the new site." The Garfield Road Project. The Garfield Road Project. Marcus wrapped both hands around his mug. The coffee was too hot to drink, but he needed something to hold. The Garfield Road Project was a 12-unit mixed-use development on the east side of town. Ray's company had won the contract in August. It was the biggest job Donovan Construction had landed in 5 years, and everyone on the crew knew it. They also knew Ray had been interviewing project managers from outside the company for the past month. Guys with degrees, guys with certifications and software fluency, and the kind of resumes that came printed on heavy paper. "You've been talking to outside people," Marcus said. "I have." "And?" Ray picked up his coffee, looked into it, set it back down. "And they're very impressive on paper, every single one of them. They know things I don't know. They know things you don't know. Scheduling software, cost modeling, all of it." He paused. "But I've been doing this 31 years, Marcus, and I have never once seen a piece of software walk onto a job site and figure out in 10 seconds that a crew is about to fall apart." Marcus said nothing. "I've watched you for 6 years. I've watched you handle men who didn't want to be handled. I've watched you solve problems before anyone else knew they were problems. I've watched you do all of that while raising a boy by yourself and never once asking for special treatment or showing up late or making excuses." Ray leaned forward slightly. "I don't need someone who can run a program. I need someone who can run a job. There's a difference, and you know there's a difference." The kitchen was very quiet. Down the hall, Caleb's breathing was inaudible, but Marcus could feel it anyway. The way you feel the presence of something essential, even when you cannot perceive it directly. "It's a salary position," Ray continued. "Benefits. Real benefits, not the garbage we've been pretending counts. Health, dental, the whole package. Caleb would be covered." Marcus's jaw tightened. He looked at the table. "The pay is $68,500 to start. Review at 6 months." Marcus had made $41,000 last year. He had made it with overtime and weekend work, and by saying yes to every shift that came his way, regardless of what it cost him in hours, he did not spend with his son. "Ray, don't answer tonight. I didn't come here at 4 in the morning to pressure you. I came here at 4 in the morning because I couldn't sleep and because I realized I'd been looking everywhere except where I should have been looking from the start." He stood. He picked up his mug and carried it to the sink and rinsed it, which was such a small and human thing to do that Marcus felt something crack open behind his sternum. Ray turned around and leaned against the counter. "You told me once that you felt like you were just keeping your head above water." You remember that? Marcus remembered. A Tuesday in February. Sleet on the ground. He had not thought anyone was listening. "I'm not offering you a life raft," Ray said. "I'm offering you a boat. What you do with it is yours." He left the way he had come, quietly, through the front door, into the dark that was just barely beginning to thin at its edges. Marcus sat at the table for a long time after that. His coffee went cold. He did not notice. The first week was the hardest because Marcus didn't know what he was building yet. Nolan had given him the framework. A new division within the company, small but with real teeth. Client relations restructured from the ground up, with Marcus running point. It meant longer hours at first. It meant learning systems he'd never touched. It meant sitting in rooms with people who had 10 years more experience and finding something useful to say anyway. He found things to say. Not because he was brilliant. He knew he wasn't brilliant. But he'd spent 9 years listening to a child explain the world back to him, in fragments and questions and leaps of logic that made no sense until suddenly they made every kind of sense. And that had taught him something no management seminar could. It had taught him to sit with not knowing, to let the shape of a thing emerge before grabbing at it. The second week, he stayed late every night until 7. Mrs. Petrova watched Caleb without complaint, though she started leaving pointed notes on the kitchen counter. "Boy needs his father. Carrots in fridge. Don't microwave them. They go soft." Asterisk. He followed her instructions on both counts. Diane called on a Wednesday. He was in the parking garage, his car still ticking from the drive. His briefcase on the passenger seat like a second body. "Caleb says you got a promotion." "It's not exactly a promotion. He says you're building something." Marcus leaned his head back against the headrest. The concrete ceiling of the garage was stained with water damage, in patterns that looked almost deliberate, like someone had started a painting and walked away. "I guess I am." "Good." A pause. Diane's pauses had always carried weight, even when they were married, especially when they were married. "He's proud of you. He won't say it like that because he's 9 and 9-year-olds don't say things like that. But he is." "How do you know?" "Because he told your mother, and your mother told me, and here we are." Marcus laughed. It came out rough and real, and he let it. "Thank you for telling me," he said. "Don't thank me. Just keep doing it." She hung up. He sat in the garage for another 5 minutes, engine off, breathing. By the third week, the work had started to take a shape he recognized. Not finished, not close to finished, but the bones were there. He'd hired 2 people, he'd restructured the intake process. He'd sat across from Nolan in the man's office and laid out a 6-month projection that Nolan had studied for a long time, without speaking before saying simply, "This is right." 2 words. Marcus was learning that the things that mattered most came in small packages. 1 sentence at a door. 2 words across a desk. He started sleeping better. Not perfectly. There were still nights when he lay awake and the old math ran through his head. The calculations of what he lacked, what he'd failed at, the distance between where he was and where he'd imagined he'd be at 41. But the calculations had less power now. They were numbers without a formula. They didn't add up to anything because he'd stopped trying to make them. On a Friday afternoon, he left work at 5 for the first time in 3 weeks. He picked Caleb up from Mrs. Petrova's. They drove to the grocery store together because the refrigerator was empty except for Eleanor's carrots and a jar of mustard that might have predated the apartment. In the produce aisle, Caleb held up a mango and said, "Do we like these?" "I don't know," Marcus said. "Do we? Let's find out." They bought the mango. They bought pasta and jarred sauce and bread and a bag of apples and a frozen pizza for Saturday. They loaded the bags into the trunk and Caleb climbed into the back seat and buckled himself in with the competence of a small adult, and Marcus stood there for a moment with his hand on the open door, looking at his son in the fading light. Something was being built. He could feel it in his chest like a second heartbeat, faint but steady. the rhythm of a life assembling itself from ordinary things. He got in the car and drove them home. The grocery store parking lot was full for a Tuesday, which meant Marcus had to park in the far row near the drainage ditch where shopping carts went to die. Caleb didn't complain. He was talking about metamorphic rocks. "The thing is, Dad, pressure doesn't destroy them. It changes them into something harder, like limestone becomes marble. Same stuff, just reorganized." "Reorganized," Marcus repeated. "Mrs. Huang says that's what makes them interesting. They have a history you can read if you know what to look for." Marcus pulled the key from the ignition and sat there a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. November now. 5 weeks since the restaurant with Jennifer. 3 weeks since Nolan Rhodes had stood in his kitchen at 4 in the morning and said the sentence that had cracked something open in him. 2 weeks since he'd walked into the new role, a desk near Nolan's office, a project scope that made his hand shake when he first read it. 1 week since he'd stopped shaking. "Dad." "Yeah." "Are we going in? Or are you doing the thing where you stare at the steering wheel?" "I don't do that." "You do that a lot." Marcus looked at his son. Caleb was wearing the jacket that was already too small. The one with the fraying cuffs he refused to give up because it had a pocket perfectly sized for the quartz he carried everywhere. His hair needed cutting. There was a smudge of something, marker maybe, or lunch, on his chin. "I was thinking," Marcus said. "About what?" "About the fact that he'd called Diane last night and they'd talked for 20 minutes without either of them raising their voice. About the fact that she'd said she was glad something was different in him, and he hadn't known how to explain what it was. About the fact that Nolan had pulled him aside on Friday and told him the preliminary numbers on the project were strong, genuinely strong. And Marcus had felt something he couldn't name until he was driving home and realized it was the absence of apology. He had not, for the first time in longer than he could calculate, felt sorry for taking up space. "Metamorphic rocks," Marcus said. Caleb grinned. "See? They're interesting." They got out of the car. The air was sharp and clean, the way it only gets in early November, that brief window before winter commits fully and everything turns grey. Marcus grabbed a cart from the corral. Caleb walked beside him, still talking. About the rock cycle now, about igneous versus sedimentary, about how his science fair project was going to be the best one because he was going to show actual samples and not just print pictures off the internet like Tyler Moss did last year. Marcus listened. He listened the way he'd been learning to listen to everything lately, not while constructing his next worry, not while running the silent arithmetic of bills and hours and failures. Just listening. The way Nolan had listened to him that night in the kitchen. The way Mrs. Petrova listened when she asked how he was, and then waited, actually waited, for the true answer. They were halfway across the lot when it happened. Caleb's hand found his. Not reaching, not grabbing, just arriving. The way it always had, small fingers threading through his, automatic as breathing, warm despite the cold. 9 years old and still willing to hold his father's hand in public, in a parking lot, in front of God and the shopping carts and anyone who might see. Marcus closed his fingers around his son's hand and held on. He thought about limestone, about pressure, about the long, slow process of becoming something harder and more beautiful than what you started as, and how you couldn't rush it, and how you couldn't skip it, and how the only thing required of you was that you not shatter before it was done. They walked through the automatic doors and into the bright, ordinary light of the store. "Okay," Caleb said, releasing his hand to grab a basket. "But we're getting the good cereal this time." "We'll see," Marcus said. But he was already reaching for it.